them as seeds or as generating good seed values uses biomimicry metaphors to emphasize their natural evolutionary role and their ecological contextuality. A seed doesn't sprout unless the environmental conditions are right for it. And it doesn't grow unless the environment continues to favor it. What story does for heuristics is to give them fertile but fictional soil to grow in, metaphors to emphasize their natural evolutionary role so we can speculate. Ecological contextuality. Of course, speculation needs to envision unless the environmental conditions are right for it. Hence the word speculative. And it doesn't grow unless the environment continues to favor it. Then we must speculate by trying out as many rigorous experiments and as many fast and frugal heuristics as possible and come up with the right, ready toolbox and blend for plunging into the future. Speculative fiction does that, and we call it science fiction when the thought experiments detailed in the speculative fiction are grounded in logic and the experimental method. There's also a distinction drawn in our culture over hard science fiction versus soft sci-fi, and on the extreme end, fantasy. The utopian trilogy Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson is beloved for the author's meticulous attention to providing realistic details drawn from physics, chemistry, biology, and engineering, so that the adventure of getting to Mars and terraforming it seems imminently plausible. The reader comes away feeling empowered because the bridges the author builds to future scenarios are supported by stone and mortar realities most of us can relate to or believe in because they aren't too remote from what we know about our own history and the laws of nature we have grappled with on this planet Earth. Gravity operates the same way throughout the solar system in tales of science fiction. And so people float around between the planets unless the story explicitly shows a spinning centripetal force module or describes some kind of magnetic boots, and they need to breathe oxygen to survive in space. In fantasy, by contrast, movie astronauts can save the movie studio money by walking around in rockets as though they were on a train. Weightlessness be damned. And Superman can take Lois Lane up and away into outer space without a spacesuit or an air tank. Fantasy movies can empower emotionally, but not physically. And if you can't distinguish between the plausible and the implausible, and use soft science fiction speculations as the basis for action, you'll most likely end up dead. Does that mean that watching Star Wars and Star Trek and other soft science fantasy fictions is useless for survival learnings? No, not at all. They naturally teach us a lot about human socio-political behavior and help us think through alien encounters and our moral ethical responsibilities and challenges. And even the fantasy technologies like jumping to hyperspace and using teleportation can inspire us to think outside the box and probe the deeper layers of our always inadequate scientific understandings. Fantasy pushes the envelope and itself provides valuable seed heuristics that can help dislodge a stuck thought process. The essential point we can pull from Dutton's book is that children are born with these superbly tuned decoupling mechanisms that allow a walled-off suspension of disbelief during role play and fantasy that enable us to relatively safely play our way to mastery of life skills and then apply those imagined outcomes to construction of an improved reality. Such is the nature of progress in a species of dreamers. For some reason, mostly political we can imagine, dreamers got a bad rap. And as Sir Ken Robinson explains in his important TED Talk, How Schools Kill Creativity, the innate capacity for divergent thinking that children come pre-built to engage in starts vanishing once they begin formal education. Schools spend so much time forcing kids to memorize and regurgitate the latest politically expedient version of truth, vetted and endorsed by the state standards, that they constrain and even destroy young people's own instinctive desire to apply the scientific method to distill truth from fiction. Through quizzes and exams that only allow for one right answer and the chance for scorn and ridicule along with bad grades for engaging in the heresy of questioning dogma and finding one's own path of inquiry to discover facts, we actually create a society of followers who neither love nor respect science and are ironically prone to demagoguery and confusion about what really constitutes fake news. Cookbook science and discouragement of debate and empirical truth-seeking in curricula crammed into short exam schedule determined deadlines has taken its toll on the scientific imagination of most of our students. To say that the average Joe and Jane hate math and science is of course contradicted by the popularity of science fiction and fantasy. What they hate, if you actually ask them, as I often do, is the experience they had in science and math classes in school. To test the idea that almost anybody could learn to appreciate science, I decided for several years while teaching in high schools in the inner city of Los Angeles to teach science through science fiction. Each day we took a Hollywood sci-fi film and watched it in half-hour blocks, stopping to analyze, discuss, and debate, and relate to themes in the textbooks. One film had a big impact on us in 1991, just after the Montreal Protocol was put into force in September of 1989 to limit ozone, the year I started teaching at that high school. We were all afraid at that time that the ozone hole would keep growing despite the emergency intervention to phase out CFCs. The movie was called Highlander 2, and it started with a more or less factual suggestion that the ozone hole would destroy agriculture, cause blindness, and change the climate. It showed dire images of starvation and suffering, and then the film, being a science fiction, fast-forwarded to the year 2020 and suggested that the solution that society used to cure the ozone hole was to have a corporation send a giant screen up into orbit to block out the sun for 30 years. The movie then says that after 3 decades without sunlight, no one has had to worry about being burned by ultraviolet radiation, but they're now suffering from depression. The suicide rate was high, and people were driving old cars. That last bit made us laugh, a neat way to justify a low special effects budget, probably. Some of the students responded that they had heard that during the 6 months of darkness in Scandinavia and the Arctic Circle each winter there were a higher number of suicides, and some suggested that the movie seemed realistic and maybe it was worth the depression of eternal darkness to keep us alive. But one clever student who had studied a bit more than the rest said, wait, I thought the movie said that the radiation getting through the ozone hole was going to destroy agriculture, but agriculture, it depends on sunlight, so how are any plants supposed to grow for 30 years when the sun is completely blocked? This movie is stupid. We had a delightful time learning science together during those years, picking apart various sci-fi movies to determine what was realistic and what was fake. And it was great to see kids pick up textbooks to arm themselves with factual knowledge, to better engage with the class debates stimulated by the movies. As I said, science education through science fiction and learning facts through fiction sounds contradictory, right? All of this brings us to your tasks in this course. We want you to both learn the science of sustainability and be prepared to teach it, share it, and improve it. Is the best way to continue stating facts, explaining truths, and insisting that everybody understand and memorize and be prepared to be quizzed on them? Or might it be better many times to develop a story that stimulates people and holds their attention and engages them in discussion? Perhaps our task is simply to plant a seed, to use the fast and frugal heuristics of emotional engagement to create that seed, generate good seed values, so that new algorithms in step with the changing environment can be developed when, now more motivated and tenacious thanks to the storyline, we devote the time and methodological investment in them. If this is true, and we can empirically test it, then perhaps fiction is the best way to achieve scientific literacy. But only if we don't demand conformity to some teacher's understanding of truth, but invite all of us blind men standing around the elephant to keep probing and touching and sharing what we observe until a clearer and more complete picture is formed, itself subject to endless and eternal revision in an infinite and expanding universe in an infinite number of multiverses. The technologies and techniques that allow us to do this may be the best way to adapt to the ever-changing structure of scientific revolutions that Thomas Kuhn talked about, and which the purveyors of fake news so often use against scientists and science education. We can finally admit that nobody knows the truth and nobody can teach it, but can then say with confidence, working together, that we, the people, can find it.